All right. Well, good morning, everyone. This is JJ Risha with Pismo Ventures and the Startup Symposium. So, as some of you may know, we're starting a series of startup symposiums instead of competition this year. And the purpose is really to showcase startups that are ready to raise capital to investors and expose them to investors across the nations. That is angel investors, high net worth individuals, and VCs. The first one we're doing this year is the Life Science Symposium, or the Life Science Startup Symposium, and it's basically concentrating on just life science companies. We will have potentially two more this year, one for B2B and the other one is for B2C. We had 100 companies join us this year for the Startup Symposium, the Life Science, and out of the 100, our selection committee selected 12 companies who will present on Thursday at 12 noon Pacific time. If you are an applicant or you have registered on Eventbrite for the presentation, you'll be able to join us, and you should receive Zoom links and invitations later today or first thing tomorrow. Pismo Ventures is a venture studio. We help startups with their startup needs, whatever it may be. We are investors and also operators that started companies. And so we get involved on a day-to-day basis in the trenches with companies to help them get to the next level, be investable. We also invest in companies and help companies raise capital. That's about it for me from an introduction standpoint. I will give it to Kwame for him to take it from here. Thank you, Kwame.
Oh, thank you very much, JJ. I'm delighted to spend this time with you. And I see that we have a nice, intimate group right now. So there should be plenty of time to have a discussion about your technologies or any questions you have about navigating the FDA. And that's going to be the topic for today. We're going to start with a high-level study, discussion of regulatory strategy, and then dive into a specific area, digital health solutions, and some of the concepts and topics and issues that are relevant for digital health solutions may be relevant for you and your company. A bit about me. I was fortunate enough, as JJ and I were chatting, I was sharing that I was fortunate enough to spend over a decade at the FDA, 12 years to be exact. And I started off reviewing cardiovascular devices, specifically cardiovascular leads. Then I moved on to be a first-line supervisor of interdisciplinary teams who evaluated ophthalmic devices. Our most famous product would be LASIK. And I finished my career as a deputy director. And I also served as an acting director of a division that evaluated a range of products from those found in a hospital setting to anesthesia, respiratory, infection control, and dental devices. It was a wonderful tenure where I got exposed to evaluating over 1,000 discrete applications personally and oversaw hundreds more. I transitioned to a role at Danaher, which is a science and technology firm that's focused, at the time was focused on bringing $1 billion worth of dental products to markets throughout the world. Because I spent a lot of time at the FDA, I was particularly interested in overseeing peer reviews so that submissions to the FDA, no matter if the product was made in Utah or Thousand Oaks, California, or North Carolina, if they were going through the FDA, we set up a process to make sure that it was high quality through leveraging the talents of our regulatory professional staff. More recently, I accepted a role at UCLA as a lecturer with Dr. Jennifer McKinney. We teach about healthcare entrepreneurship. And I also have been fortunate enough to be a co-principal investigator evaluating medtech innovation from the regulatory and reimbursement standpoint for medtech, digital health, and diagnostics. And finally, I consulted the NIH. Specifically, I support companies and help them navigate regulatory strategy when they are treating clinical specialties, including the heart, lung, blood, and sleep. So I spend my time working a great deal with early stage companies, and I'm going to share some things that I've learned both at the FDA and working with early stage companies as a consultant over the last 4.5 years. So this is the lens we're going to think about regulatory and how to navigate the FDA. We have a particular focus on the FDA, and we'll particularly talk about megatrends that are most relevant to the FDA. The topics are ones that I step through and any regulatory affairs professional will step through in some form or fashion. This is how I organize it based on a strategy that a professor at University of Virginia has developed. One is the arena. And for our discussion, the arena will be the United States. Sometimes companies have a parallel market track where they're trying to enter the market in the US and often EU. Then we'll talk about the different vehicles that are most relevant and most common. And for vehicles, we're going to talk about FDA applications, interactions with the FDA through a formal or semi-formal process. We'll discuss staging, when you should talk to the FDA specifically. We'll touch on when you might need a consultant versus a full-time equivalent, and also discuss the economic logic, the value created by reaching certain regulatory milestones. And this is amplified and refined based on the research we've done at the UCLA. Specifically, the website is medtechstudy.com, where you can download a 44 plus page report that goes into the regulatory barriers in the United States, the EU, and other markets, and the role of reimbursement for medtech companies. And we'll conclude with an overview of megatrends that some of you may fit in. And we will have plenty of time. This is scheduled to go an hour and 15 minutes. So because of that, we'll have plenty of time to discuss any questions that you might have. And because it's a fairly intimate setting with a relatively small number of participants, we can dive into your questions in some level of depth. So these are the common questions that companies I meet have. And sometimes they are large multinationals, but generally an early stage company really wants an objective third body. And that objective third body could be a law firm, it could be a regulatory consulting firm, it could be an in-house vice president of regulatory, but they want someone to confirm whether they are using the right application type. Seems simple, but it is a common first question. The second common question is, how long will it really take to get my FDA approval? And generally speaking, one can estimate on the order of magnitude of months. And it is difficult and nearly impossible to estimate down to the day when one might get approval until you're getting really close to the end. How many patients do I really need? The largest cost driver for most product development is the clinical trial, if needed. And the key question is the size of the trial, is it appropriate? And related to that, is the design appropriate such that the FDA would accept it? And sometimes there's a tangential question of whether the study is designed such that some of the data would be useful for CMS. And finally, and we'll talk about this in detail because it applies to any company, whether you're regulated by the Center for Drugs, Center for Devices, or Center for Biologics. The question is, how do I prepare for an FDA meeting? And at some point, you will meet with the FDA if you're regulated. And often, if you want to create the most value for your company, you will go through the FDA, and we'll talk about how to get ready for that engagement. As we think about the arena, what market we want to enter, And this is true for most moderately to highly regulated markets. One considers three main things: the indications for use, and this can be broken down into the specific patient population one is targeting, the environment in which the product will be used to treat or diagnose patients, any specific technological features that are key to the mode of action. Those are some key elements of a indications for use statement. And that's needed to even begin to search for relevant regulations, guidances, and sometimes even laws that pertain to your product. The second important part of this are the specific product features. Is it software only as a medical device? Is it an electromechanical system? Is it one that has a biologic or a drug associated with it or combined with it? Those features will also drive the regulatory strategy and the types of markets that may be most appropriate, or at least inform you as to the markets where you can get through them quickly or not as quickly based on those features. And finally, what are the claims that you're going to make associated with the device? Are you claiming that the device diagnoses a particular condition? Are you claiming the device aids in the diagnosis of a condition? Are you claiming that the product aids in the diagnosis of a condition for patients living a healthy lifestyle? Depending on the claims you make, your application type, the appropriate regulations will shift. So when talking about ARENA, these are the three main elements that you should consider as you're developing that first market and identifying that first market. And these questions are often stepped through in cross-functional teams where regulatory is working shoulder to shoulder with the head of marketing, the chief medical officer, the head of quality, and sometimes even the president of the organization to set this early regulatory strategy in place. And to further understand the arena in which you're working, one can look to a range of resources. Some of these are obvious, and the United States is regarded as one of the most transparent regulatory markets in the world, or regulatory bodies, such that you can search a fair amount of publicly available data to understand the predicates, the most common devices that are closest to your product, no matter what it is, biologic, drug, or device, and how FDA thinks about it in terms of specific preclinical, animal, and clinical data needed to assess the safety and efficacy or effectiveness of the device. One can easily go to competitors' websites, which can drive searching for their regulatory status, and you can tap into more academic databases like PubMed, talk to consultants, and also look at the post-market activity, which often will be important to understand FDA's thinking about the safety of a product. Is it a morcellator where there was a lot of post-market activity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this graphic, the purpose of this graphic is merely to establish for one particular area, digital health, there's been a robust amount of activity in terms of guidances that are appropriate. And this is true for other areas. There's a part of the FDA website that focuses on women's health, or the health of women. There is a Center for Digital Health Excellence at the on the FDA's website. So for some places, there's one-stop shopping where you can understand the FDA's thinking. The last example, and we'll talk about this a bit more, is with regard to COVID and emergency use authorization. So you can learn the latest with regards to when the FDA is going to wind down the existing guidance, maybe even get clues to the guidance that will remain after the public health emergency. And it's all in one place for those types of products. And for the United States, they tend to be personal protective equipment, PCR diagnostics, antigen-based diagnostics, et cetera. So products used in the detection of COVID or treatment of COVID in some form or fashion. Or again, PPE for preventing transmission. So this is the general risk framework for those relatively new to the FDA. And this is true for medical devices. And this is what an executive will want to keep top of mind. For some of you, you are a vice president of operations, COO, CMO, CEO. And the goal of this talk is to not make you any sort of expert in regulatory, but the goal of this conversation is to expose you to the key concepts such that they are top of mind, ideally, when you're consulting with regulatory experts, so that you, to some extent, can speak their language. There's very little regulations associated for low-risk devices. For most, they have to adhere to what's called good manufacturing practices. Now, while that is the lowest level of regulatory requirements, it still is fairly robust system of procedures, instructions, and directions for all personnel engaged in making a medical device. The lion's share of products that come to market and have regulations associated with them are class 2 or moderate risk devices. These products fall into 3 main categories for the device area: medtech, digital health, and diagnostics. And they can cross everything from having requirements for guidances, for test standards, for testing, test standards that are international often and recognized by the FDA, and bench and animal testing that often assess the preliminary safety of the product and or biocompatibility. Generally speaking, the clinical data is well under 1,000 patients, often under 250 patients. For the highest risk products, which are life-sustaining and life-supporting, the FDA has the highest level of requirements. This involves often a application called premarket application, which has a laundry list of requirements, and often, with only 1 or 2 exceptions, requires prospective, often randomized controlled clinical trials. And these studies can be north of 400 patients, and they can be representative, must be representative of the US population. Having said that, these clinical studies can involve patients from outside the United States, as long as they adhere to the guidance the FDA has promulgated for how to collect data from patients from outside the United States. Now let's talk about COVID and COVID-related guidances. The purpose of these next few slides is just to let you know that the FDA does have a set of requirements that are scaled down relative to the requirements needed for traditional applications, in the hopes to accelerate the review time for any COVID-related products used to treat patients suffering from the pandemic. I'm highlighting a few that are tangentially related to the actual epidemic, but the FDA is deemed important to promote public health, specifically devices and studies used in treatment of psychiatric conditions that may be software as a medical device. The barrier to entry in the market has been lower because of that. The level of software documentation is slightly lessened. And however, issues like cybersecurity, hazard analysis, and proper labeling are still required. The testing, size of the test used for some of the diagnostics is less than what we've seen in traditional applications, but there still is a requirement to produce and perform prospective clinical studies, for example, for PCR diagnostics used to treat COVID. Now, are these studies 1,000 patient studies? No. Would you happen to sometimes need to enroll hundreds of patients to hit the endpoint of 30 patients, for example, for one of the requirements? Perhaps. But the main point is the FDA is attempting to be least burdensome, and the requirements are commensurate with the potential benefits to the public by getting these products quickly reviewed. The reality is that over the last couple years, because of the large influx of applications, sometimes the resources at the FDA are strained, which impacts application reviews not only for COVID-related devices, but also devices outside of COVID, because reviewers at the FDA have been surged to work on those products. I'm going to talk about some key FDA decisions, and the purpose really is not to have a 1 hour and 15-minute conversation on digital health, but it's to highlight a few key elements of any regulated product that would apply to whether you are a device, even a drug, or a biologic. First is prescription digital therapeutics, which were pioneered by Pear Therapeutics. And the initial study, as you can see, required 507 patients in a randomized controlled study. And the application type was de novo. And it means just what it sounds like from the Latin. It was new. However, the risk could be mitigated to keep it moderate risk with a special control. That special control was the randomized control study that I just mentioned. There's also Endeavor RX, which not so long ago conducted a 600 patient study, again, because it was not a high risk, but moderate risk device used in the treatment of ADHD patients. And INUT, which is a Los Angeles-based company, conducted a 1,000 patient study in a prospective randomized control study via 510K after the first company went to market via de novo and conducted a similar study. And that's the regulatory framework for the de novo process. The first product to get to market is granted a de novo, and then the second uses the clinical trial and other special controls, and the application type is a 510K. At a very high level, no matter if you are regulated as a drug, a device, a diagnostic, a biologic, these are the main steps in your journey through the FDA. And it starts with preclinical in terms of data collecting activities. And this assumes that you are in a good manufacturing practice and adhering to a quality system regulation such that you are developing, because it is mandated, clinical strategy and SOPs and procedures and templates to inform the types of activities that need to be conducted for the FDA in this case. A clinical strategy such that the protocols needed for pilot, pivotal, et cetera, are in line with FDA's guidance and thinking, most current thinking. And you're conducting the verification testing needed. After that, after a pilot study, for example, one would engage in the larger pivotal study. And in the drug world, this would be analogous to a phase 2 or phase 3 study. And they often need to be multi-site and have geographic diversity and patient population diversity, whether you're conducting those studies in the United States or elsewhere. And finally, and this is probably after 1 to 3 interactions with the FDA, you actually submit your formal application. Particularly if it's novel, you'll be talking to the FDA about things like whether your product is eligible for breakthrough designation. Can you reanalyze data based on the clinical study that was done? And can you collect post-market data to complement and perhaps minimize the amount of prospective data you needed to collect? These are all types of submissions and formal conversations you can have with the FDA along your journey, in addition to the traditional actual application that allows you to market the product. in the United States. Here are some challenges that would apply for electrical mechanical systems, some of them do, and products, no matter how you're regulated, whether it be in drugs, devices, or biologics. Here's one specific to devices, software development. And it is critical that one think through these main elements. Obviously, proper verification and validation, but specifically cybersecurity. I've been fortunate enough to work with a fair amount of companies that are software driven or software as a medical device and get recent sets of questions from the FDA. And there's also often a significant number of questions that focus on cybersecurity. Training. Training software, it's important to ensure that the raw data is appropriate, acceptable, and useful in training your AI solution. And this is a big, ensuring before you start the clinical study that you have determined the most appropriate endpoints, the control, duration of the actual study, and follow-up period. These are typical important issues that need to be agreed upon before you start any pivotal clinical trial, so that you don't waste valuable resources and time. Breakthrough designation. It's important to determine whether breakthrough designation makes sense for you to apply. For some companies, it will be apparent that there isn't a new patient population or dramatic improvement in outcomes based on your technology. For example, if you're the 10th 510K in a particular area. But if you really are bleeding edge, if you're a software as a medical device to treat TBI, for example, or if you're a combination product that has dramatically improved outcomes in cardiovascular. If you think you may be a candidate for breakthrough designation, it's important to have access to the right experts in the field, clinical KOLs, so they can help you prepare the strongest case for potential breakthrough designation. And take a long-term view. Make sure that you're committed to what will likely be a multi-year process to get a really bleeding edge product from concept to commercialization. And then pre-certification program. This is a relatively new program that is used for companies that want to co-create tests with the FDA to develop the requirements for software as a medical device products. So here are some key considerations, sometimes in concert with the strategic. One is your capital patient. Do you have a strategic view that if you're really producing something that will require clinical data, and the UCLA research backs this up, do you have 66 months, for example, to get through the de novo process? Do you have complementary skills, or at least a core team and such that you know you can bring in regulatory, quality, clinical, reimbursement, software, data privacy experts, data security experts, so that you can, without a doubt, be confident that you put together the best possible application for the interdisciplinary team at the FDA. And then finally, for your reimbursement story, does the product come with a new code, or will you be able to leverage existing codes to make money early on? And that's something you can discuss early on while you're discussing regulatory clinical requirements with the FDA through a specific program to get that feedback early. So when should you start talking to the FDA? It's important that you think about talking to the FDA when you want to clarify a pathway, when you have questions about testing that's needed, when you're not sure about the product code. The feedback can take 75 days, and there are specific user fee designated targets for that. And the big caution, if you don't have time, in addition, if you don't have time, is to consider whether your questions are unfocused. If you have unfocused questions, you will have unfocused responses. So for clinical considerations, what's most important? We talked about this briefly, but I'll highlight a few key elements. One, be sure that you have the time for conducting a relatively long study with plenty of buffer to consider enrollment, etc. Do you have the right biostatistician on board? Do you have the cash to execute testing month after month? And if you leverage OUS data, is that representative of US data? Specifically, is it also in accordance with good clinical practices? Typically, for bleeding edge solutions, you want to partner with a clinical research organization such that you are making sure you adhere to the myriad of requirements for conducting a proper clinical study. Differentiation. What are some best practices when you have that formal meeting? Often it's called a pre-something meeting, a pre-NDA meeting, a pre-submission meeting. It's a meeting to get early feedback, typically on the preclinical, animal, or clinical data needed for your FDA application. And these are not intended to be lengthy documents. It could be 50 pages or less. And the idea is to ensure that you provide the basic information about the product, specific questions related to specific documents that you sent to the FDA. And when you conduct the actual conversation with the FDA, it's important that you know the deciders in the room and evaluate on your side the right people to cover the germane topics for discussion at that meeting, and also have a good note taker. It seems like a pretty obvious thing, but having a good note taker will free up your team to facilitate understanding deeply FDA's comments and concerns. Economic logic. Early on in your journey, most of your team may be consultants. And there's going to come a time where you want the in-house expertise of quality and regulatory. Perhaps after you have your quality management system in place, perhaps after you have that first product, regulated product through the FDA. Perhaps it's 6 months prior if it's a particularly complex FDA application process. But it's important that you think through not only the people, but the processes you need in place to build a long-standing regulated product. And a lot of that will be based on your adherence to the quality systems regulations. Here's the value that could come from interacting with the FDA. First of all, some of these mechanisms are free or discounted for small businesses. And through our research at UCLA, we realized that they can add specific value. Now, these are not the latest numbers. These are broad ranges. If you look at the report I cited, it'll give you more granularity in terms of cost and time to go to from concept commercialization for 510K devices, for example. It's less than $5 million in 2022. But the main point here is that for regulated products, when you hit meaningful regulatory milestones, you create value. And this value is based on us at UCLA having researched over 105 FDA regulated companies. So let's talk about megatrades. And we're going to talk about non-traditional entrants, how COVID is related, impacted telehealth, and a few more that you see on this slide. And this will be the last portion of our discussion. I see that there's some comments in the chat and in Q&A. And again, we have plenty of time to cover these. And because it's a nice, intimate group, we may have time for follow-up so that we can really try and understand what's top of mind for you in your company. So non-traditional entrants are not that new anymore. I would add to that first bullet, Meta, and they are looking at interesting ways to monetize data and or leverage their skills in tech to develop often software as medical device products, digital health solutions that in the beginning may be used in lifestyle, but often long-term can be turned into prescription digital therapeutics. And the important challenge and opportunity for non-traditional entrants is to build capacity, either through joint ventures with traditional medical device companies or with startups who have deep expertise in medtech, healthcare in general. Tech investors are coming into medtech, but they have blind spots, and those often revolve around regulatory, reimbursement, clinical, and proper quality documentation. And again, for this talk, the important thing is to know the types of issues that are relevant in this field, in the FDA regulated field. So when you're having that conversation with a regulatory person, you have a sense for what are key issues in the field. Telehealth has really exploded, as we all know, and there's an amazing statistic that there's been a 3x increase in the amount of investment dollars in the space since COVID began. Even though the public health crisis seems to be winding down, I suspect that there will still continue to be interest because of the unique ability and potential for telehealth solutions to drive improved outcomes. Increased and sustained use for particular conditions, I think, will persist, particularly getting unneeded personnel out of the surgical suite so that it can maximize their productivity, and also interesting uses of mixed reality to facilitate more accurate procedures to improve outcomes. The CMS rule for breakthrough devices is on pause, but it'll be interesting to learn how breakthrough devices are reimbursed by CMS. And then guidances that allow for treatment of psychiatric conditions may persist after the public health crisis. Even if they don't, the FDA has laid out a pathway for a transition for folks that were operating under enforcement discretion, companies that are operating under enforcement discretion, to allow them to operate for a period of time while their traditional application is under review. Aging parents, aging in the home and related mental health conditions like Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, etc., are important. And there are unique opportunities, for example, for robots to help in the home. A company called Tombot is one example, which is a companion robot to help elderly dealing with symptoms associated with dementia. They are first a consumer product, not making any outcomes claims, but there is a path with rigorous clinical trials to allow them to make claims to be regulated by the FDA. Similarly, but more upregulated, is a company called Stratos, which is a monitoring system for coughing and wheezing, which eventually can be used to help monitor coughing and wheezing in the home and aid doctors to titrate drugs or to facilitate recovery. The Internet of Medical Things is increasingly important for large companies that are creating diagnostics used in a hospital setting. And the opportunity is to connect those devices and leverage the data in combined fashion from different diagnostic tools by the bedside for new actionable insights, or show those actionable insights on one screen at one place, perhaps in a heads-up display that is integrated such that it helps the clinician make quicker, more accurate decisions that ideally will drive outcomes, longer patient stays, reduced rehospitalization rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how they integrate with strategics in the ecosystem will be key. if you have a dominant player like a Medtronic, for example, with a collection of bedside devices, and you are a startup, it's important to be able to articulate and build products that adhere to international standards, but can also easily plug in to the ecosystems that are already established for certain dominant global strategics. I can't stress this enough. Cybersecurity has become a key consideration for the FDA. If you're sending patient data to the cloud, cybersecurity and working with a cybersecurity expert is a must. In addition, considering HIPAA is table stakes for any software-driven or software-enabled product. So the Internet of Medical Things is a mega trend that will persist as long as there are bedside monitors and other diagnostics to treat patients. And we'll see that potentially in applications outside of the hospital. So there are many places where the Internet of Medical Things will continue to persist. And those who can organize information, data, so it's useful for the patient will win in the future. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you, this formal part of the conversation. And I'm delighted that we have plenty of time to talk about things that are important to you. I see that there are some questions in the chat. And JJ, I see, let's see, post your questions. Well, thank you for that, Mohan. Thank you, Robert. Let's see if there's anything in Q&A. Okay, let's start with Mohan. I have a healthcare startup that is an app. Do I need an FDA approval to commercialize it? Well,
yeah, you could see all the Q&A, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let me dive in. Let me tackle it. Well,
all
Mohan,
right,
yeah, Jay, this is fun. Before I can answer that, Mohan, there are three main questions I would need to know from you. One, do you have an indication statement for this app? Is it used to treat diabetic patients? Is it used to treat diabetic patients in a hospital setting, in the home? What ages are you seeking to treat? Are you helping to diagnose or treat? Are you aiding in the diagnosis? Are you providing well understood clinical indices? And I'm not trying to pepper you with a whole lot of questions, but those are things that will be in the indications for use statement. The second question is, and based on those answers, you can determine the relative risk to the patient, if there's a doctor in the loop, and then there may be guidance called a clinical decision support software guidance that will be germane, such that the FDA has said, based on this risk, you do not need to submit a formal application. The second part to understand whether you need a formal application is the technological characteristics. Does your software rely on AI? Is that AI based on well understood clinical procedures or protocols or scientific literature? And then the third thing is related to indications for use. What specific claims do you want to make? After we answer all those things, we could get a better sense of whether FDA approval is needed. The most simplest way, Mohan, to understand whether FDA approval is required is through a formal process called a 513G, where you would submit that information to the FDA and ask them specifically if it's regulated by the FDA, and if so, what is the appropriate regulation, product code, et cetera. And they will actually come back in approximately 75 days, sometimes a little bit longer, with a specific answer to that question. Sometimes you can ask that question in what's called a pre-submission meeting request, which is free, but the most direct way to get that done is either to go to the FDA with the 513G, or you can ask a consultant to do an independent assessment. But the most direct way is to go straight to the FDA. Oren, you asked, can you talk about DTX and relevant process? How is it different from medical device de novo classification? Okay, DTX, digital therapeutic. Digital therapeutic is the example I talked about from Pear, and it is a catch-all term to describe software-only products that can be used to treat a condition. Pear is used to treat insomnia, depression, and a couple other conditions. And it is considered actually by the FDA to be a medical device. And depending on the indication, technological characteristics, and claims, the FDA may consider it new, such that they've never seen anything like it before. I'm working with a company in the ophthalmic space, and I'll leave it at that, where the FDA, that is software only as a medical device, but the type of diagnostic they want to build in the arena, in the patient population that they're seeking to help diagnose, there was a determination the FDA had never seen anything like that. And the way you find that out is by having a pre-submission meeting with the FDA. It could be a pre-submission meeting where you want to talk about the verification testing that you think you need to do. And then by having that conversation, you may add another question. And the specific question is there an appropriate regulation for this product? We couldn't find one. And the FDA often will come back and say, we're not aware of a device quite like yours, and we think it's eligible for de novo. So DTX in my world, Oren, and prescription digital therapeutic are kissing cousins. So there may be a digital therapeutic that isn't prescribed, and that would be, and perhaps this is your second question, the rigor for that digital therapeutic may be a bit less, and perhaps it's more appropriate to be regulated as a 510K. Definitely in general, the prescription digital therapeutic, if you're the first to market, is often considered de novo if you're treating an indication that's never been treated before. But if you have maybe a lighter term called digital therapeutic, and maybe your claims are a little bit lesser and it is not prescribed, Warren, then the regulatory bar may be lower. It may even fall under what's called the wellness device category, such that the FDA has said your product is based on well understood procedures in the literature, and it's labeled to be used for patients in a healthy lifestyle. And for all these reasons, according to this wellness guidance, we believe that it does not need an FDA application. And this could be an app to help you monitor your heart rate. And it doesn't make any unique claims about heart rate or condition. It could be one to help you monitor your sleeping. And it's clearly used for consumers to help them, but not meant to replace the doctor. And it isn't prescribed. And those, again, may have a lower regulatory bar, or what you might consider no regulatory bar because it falls under enforcement discretion. Okay, now, Mohan is back, and thank you for that, Mohan. Yep, you came back to clarify. I appreciate it. This app helps veterans with PTSD, and when I commercialize it, it will be for mental health. We'll have to go through the FDA. Well, based on the limited information you provided and what I know about PTSD in general and the risk associated with misdiagnosing or mistreating patients suffering from PTSD, there is a above average chance that your app may be regulated by the FDA. Now, I would be conducting what's called regulatory malpractice if I definitively said your product needs to go through the FDA. I have worked with companies that are that have claims to treat PTSD, and there was a regulatory path, there was a clinical data requirement. So when I've worked with software as a medical device or electromechanical systems, to be more specific, used to aid in the treatment of PTSD, they have been regulated by the FDA. I have not worked with a solely software company yet used to treat PTSD, but because of the risk profile of that patient population, it may be regulated by the FDA. But the devil's in the detail. But I think thinking about the FDA and based on this interaction, what I would recommend is having some sort of assessment by a regulatory consultant to help guide you. And sometimes, if you're working with the VA, I'm extrapolating and making a couple of guesses. You may be able to use VA dollars or different grant mechanisms to help pay for that regulatory consultation. Mike, can you get a copy of the PowerPoint? Absolutely. And I do work with companies at all stages. So thanks for that question. Oh, and thanks for clarifying. It's for diagnosis. So if it is indeed for diagnosis of PTSD, Mohan, I have a pretty strong sense that the FDA would regulate this. Again, I can't say for certain, but as we've gotten to know the product a little bit better, and the relevant experience I've had with products in this space, they have been, based on the claims that you may want to make, they have been regulated. I certainly can, sir. I can I can recommend consultants. We can handle that offline for sure. I can, oh, you actually, let me minimize it. You can just email me here, Kwame Ulmer at kwame.ulmer@ulmerventures.com, and we can work offline. Let's see. I don't see any, well, thank you, Mohan. I don't see any more questions in the chat.
Yeah, no questions. Anyone has any more questions, please post them in the Q&A. Can you, I understand that you're able to help these companies. First of all, a lot of information here that I did not know. So really great information. Much appreciated.
Sure.
So if any of these companies need help, they can reach out to you for assistance?
Yes, they can. Okay, I was just double checking. You can simply just send me an email, and I can try and assist you as best I can.
Yeah, and you can always reach out to me. Everybody should have my email address as well, and I'll make sure you get connected with Kwame as well. Also, the slides will be available on YouTube by tomorrow morning, along with the recording. So this was broadcasted on YouTube, and YouTube usually publishes it, and we have it open to the public by tomorrow, and we'll associate the slides with it. Kwame, if you could send them to me, we'll put them up alongside the recording as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Anybody, any more questions? One last chance to talk to Kwame. All right. Well, thank you very much. There's one more expert panel coming up next at 1 p.m. in about half an hour. So please make sure you join, and please make sure you join us on the 31st in a couple of days to view the 12 presenting companies that are presenting to the expert or the investor panel. All the best, Kwame. That was really great. I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you, JJ. Thank you very much.
Have a great day.